Good afternoon, everybody. We're really honoured to have, I'll give him his full title, Professor Nick James, Director of Cancer Research Unit and Professor of Clinical Oncology at Warwick University. He's been in charge of the Stampede trial, and he's going to give us, I think we're the first non-medical group that he's going to give us the results to. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here today, and yeah, this is only the second time these. Well, you've got a bigger slide set here than just the presentation I gave the other week in America on the Stampede trial. But it's only the second time that these have been presented in public. Can you hear me at the back? Is the PA working? No. Yeah. So yes. Okay. You actually know where you are, of course. This is where I work at Warwick. This is QE, which obviously you can see is just next door, which is where I've worked clinically for the last 20 years. And there's a couple of things I'd just like to go through ahead of the Stampede trial results, because there's been a lot of data we've been able to get out of the trial, apart from the primary questions, which what we set out to do with the trials to address the questions: if we used available drugs earlier on in the disease course, did we get better results than if we saved them for later, is essentially the question we're asking. But because so many men have kindly agreed to enter the trial, we can answer a lot of other questions as well. And one of the things that is very striking to me is I get to see a lot of people coming to me for second opinions. And in the main, there was nothing much wrong with the first opinion in terms of the treatment that was being offered. And often what is wrong with the first opinion was that the prognosis was completely wrong. So people get given often an inappropriately gloomy prognosis because people, and I'm talking about my professional colleagues here, have a knowledge that is sort of fossilised at the point where they finish their training and things move on. And so one of the things we were very keen to look at for the Stampede trial was to say, actually we've got a big cohort of men recruited with uniformly high-risk cancer, so patients we would expect to do badly. And one of the things that's been very striking is that they've collectively done much less badly than we might have expected from the outset of the trial, even in the control arm. So all we've done is give the standard treatment, so we've not done anything fancy to them. Now they may well be getting better care in the sense that we're following people more proactively, so you might be intervening more quickly, so that might improve the prognosis. And I'll show you some ways in which we've done that. We've shown, and we can show that that's happened. But we've just published one paper, about to publish a second paper on the outcomes in the control arm, which are very instructive in themselves. So I'm going to actually start with that. So this is what bad prostate cancer actually looks like in terms of the outcomes. So I'm going to skip through this because you probably don't need to particularly know too much about the trial. The trial itself has quite significant novelty to it. So in general with new treatments, what we do is, so each of these is a potential new treatment, is we'll assess each one separately, anything that's interesting, so the green one and the blue one and the purple one here look interesting. You'll then assess in a second trial where you compare your shiny new treatment with whatever the standard treatment is. Now the problem with this is that these trials are all competing with each other, and it takes a long time, a lot of patients to work through all of these. So what we did in the Stampede trial was say, right, well, if something's got enough data to look interesting and safe, we'll start from the outset comparing it against the standard treatment and have a series of sort of interim looks at the data. If you like, it's like a high jump contest. All the arms all the troops in the trial have to sort of jump over an increasing barrier in terms of performing better than the control treatment in order to carry on being looked at. So it took quite a lot of effort getting multiple different treatments in the trial, but once you've done it, it runs much more efficiently because you can assess lots of different things at the same time, and as you also see, we've added additional assessments in as well. So it's proven to be an extremely efficient way of answering lots of different questions all at the same time within one structure, rather than setting up in this model here, you've got 7 different trials instead of 1 trial. So you've got obvious efficiencies, financial, quite apart from anything else. I'll skip through this. So we call this a multi-arm, multi-stage trial, and so the trial itself has a novel design. There's not very many other trials out there with this design, and this is by far the biggest. So the principle is we're testing many relevant agents of interest at the same time, and there's this sort of high jump contest element to it, where in order to carry on assessing a treatment in the trial, we do interim analyses to make sure it's still looking interesting and still looking safe. So it's quite a novel way of doing it. Now, apologies, some of these slides are a bit technical, but when we get to technical slides, if I've lost you, please put your hand up and stop me, and I will try and explain what the graphs and so on mean. Essentially, what we set out to do in the trial was to recruit men who were starting long-term androgen deprivation therapy, ADT for short. And so the hormone therapy has been one of the mainstays of treatment for prostate cancer since the 1940s. And there's been remarkably little shift for many groups until quite recently. And in order to do a trial, you've got to define who you want to put in the trial. So we defined the men we wanted to put in as belonging to one of these groups. So men with disease that was confined to the prostate, but with features which we know predict it was going to do badly with a high chance of spreading. So T3-4 means it's spreading into the through the capsule and maybe into the adjacent organs like the rectum or the bladder. PSA, I'm sure is something you're familiar with, so a high PSA. And the Gleason score, I suspect most of you are familiar with as well. So Gleason score of 8 to 10 defines tumours that do badly. Or we wanted tumours where it has spread to the lymph nodes, and I'll come back to this group in particular, or men presenting with metastatic disease, or men who'd had previous surgery or radiotherapy who relapsed with aggressive-looking features as well. So this is what we set out to do at the beginning. So on all of these slides, there's a whole series of them. Orange is what we planned to do, and there's a timeline along the top here, and the different arms listed down here. And so we started out with 5 different experimental arms. So the standard treatment on its own, which was androgen deprivation therapy with or without radiotherapy, depending on whether it was deemed appropriate, and we changed our thinking on this as the trial went on, as to who it was necessary to give radiotherapy. And then we added to whatever the clinician thought was the right treatment as a base treatment, a number of different treatments. So zoledronic acid, which is licensed as a bone-protecting agent and is widely used for relapsed prostate cancer affecting the bones. Docetaxel, which is a chemotherapy drug, again licensed 2004, so just before we set the trial up, on the basis of improving survival in relapsed prostate cancer. We put one slightly speculative drug in, celecoxib. So this is the basis of this is there was a lot of epidemiological data suggesting that men who were on either aspirin or related non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs appeared to have better outcomes than men who weren't on aspirin or one of these drugs. And there's some data as well suggesting that anti-inflammatory drugs potentially are anti-cancer drugs as well. So at the time we set it up, it seemed a hypothesis worth testing. As it subsequently transpired, it had quite a modest impact and certainly not enough to change practice. But it seemed worth testing at the time. And then we thought we'd look at a couple of combinations. So docetaxel and zoledronic acid together, and celecoxib with zoledronic acid as well. So to start with, it started quite slowly. It took us quite a while to get our first 100 patients in. We had a sort of initial pilot phase, because one of the things we weren't sure was going to happen with the trial was that most men are diagnosed through the urology clinic. Urologists don't give drugs like zoledronic acid or docetaxel, they're given by oncologists like myself. And so in order to put patients in the trial, urologists would have to refer newly diagnosed patients to oncologists. So 2 groups of people had to agree this was a good idea. Apart from the patients themselves, the urologists had to agree that they wanted to hand patients on. And people get remarkably territorial about these things. They're their patients, they're not our patients. And the second thing was that the oncologists had to agree to take on this extra workload. And thirdly, of course, both of us, urologist, oncologist, whoever's doing the talking, has to persuade people to go into what on the face of it looks like a very complicated trial. 5 different arms, drugs on their own in combinations, treatments going on for 2 years, giving chemotherapy to a group where, at the time we set the trial up in 2005, chemotherapy had only been licensed the year before. So it wasn't terribly mainstream practice giving chemotherapy to prostate cancer patients. So there was a number of things we weren't sure whether they would work or not. But anyway, it turned out they all did work. Urologists and oncologists did put patients in the trial. Patients were, as it turns out, in vast numbers, happy to consent to go into the trial. And so not that long after we passed 500 patients, so it recruited at an accelerated, and it still continues to recruit at an accelerating rate. So 1,000 patients plus in 2009. At this point we tried to recruit groups from mainland Europe. We ended up, the only group that in the end ended up going with us in the trial was the Swiss group. And then we finally, going back to the high jump design, we got to our first interim analysis comparing the arms against the control. So the comparison we're looking at is, do the treatments we're testing delay the time taken to relapse? So we're expecting most patients, especially the metastatic patients, to relapse in a year or so, 18 months, from starting their hormone therapy, the PSA to start going up. So what we're looking to see is, in the main, the time taken for the PSA to start rising again increase. And the first round, like in a high jump contest, is actually quite a low barrier. All the arms got through it. Past 2,000 patients not long after that, and then we got to the second activity stage in 2011. At this point, the arms containing celecoxib didn't meet the criteria we'd specified, so they knocked the hurdle off the high jump. But the 3 remaining arms, zoledronic acid, docetaxel, and the combination, not very surprisingly, did. And so they carried on recruiting. So these 2 arms stopped at this point. And at this point, we'd sort of thought at the start that multi-arms didn't necessarily mean they had to all stop and start at the same time. But when we set the trial up, we picked what looked like the best bet agents. So anyway, by the point we got to here, we knew the trial was going to recruit. And we also knew by this point that abiraterone was going to be licensed. So we actually started negotiations with Janssen. Well, we didn't know, but we put patients, all the centres who were putting patients in the abiraterone trials, it was pretty obvious the drug was very active. And so we started discussions with Janssen, who owned the drug, around adding the drug to the trial. So the drug actually started in the trial before the drug was licensed, or around about the same time the drug was licensed. And we kind of had space in the trial because we'd already got rid of these 2 arms. So we knew the trial was recruiting well. We knew we had enough patients to power up an extra, the statistical power for a number of other arms. So we added a new arm in. And this again is quite novel in trials. You might think it's an absolutely blindingly obvious thing to do, to add things to a trial that's going already rather than set up a new one. But actually it's considered not done and not quite proper. And we had a lot of fights over with various funders and regulators as to whether this was legal even to do, to sort of bolt things on afterwards as an afterthought. But anyway, we got the argument in the end. So we added abiraterone in. Before we added it in, one of the principles we've done is we've always asked all our investigators, we haven't just sort of imposed it on people, we've asked all our investigators and anybody else we can lay our hands on who have an opinion, whether they think it's a good idea. I mean, there was a lot of hype, as you may remember, around abiraterone, so everybody wanted it in the trial. Patients, doctors, Cancer Research UK, Medical Research Council were the main sort of supporters of the trial. So it duly went in, and we carried on recruiting. So we did a further interim analysis. By this time, actually, we'd almost finished recruitment. Now we closed out recruitment to these original arms around the same time we're sort of hooked on adding new arms now. We added another arm. So the question we're looking at now, and I'll come back to the issue of who should get radiotherapy. So whilst the trial was going on, so we put abiraterone in because abiraterone was clearly an active drug. There were 2 very large trials looking at whether for men with high-risk prostate cancer that hadn't spread, if you added radiotherapy, did you get a better outcome or not? So the sort of consensus view was that if you had very high-risk features, if you gave radiotherapy, you just added toxicity without adding any benefit. So 2 big trials were done, one in Scandinavia, one in the UK and Canada, where half the men had hormone therapy alone, half the men had hormone therapy plus radiotherapy. both trials showed very conclusively that you halved the risk of prostate cancer death by adding radiotherapy. So at that point, around about this point here, we made it compulsory if you went in the trial, if you met the criteria of those other trials, that you should have radiotherapy. So we're then thinking, well, if it works so well at this end of the spectrum being in the trial, maybe it'll add benefit even if the cancer has already spread in the metastatic group. And there's precedent for that in other cancers. So for example, in kidney cancer, 2 big trials showed that if you take the kidney out in men who present and women who present with kidney cancer that's spread, the secondary spread will grow more slowly in the absence of the sort of mothership, as it were. And so we thought this was a question worth testing. We didn't think we wanted to test it with surgery because we know a lot of these patients would struggle to recover from surgery with just being diagnosed with metastatic disease. But actually it's quite easy to deliver radiotherapy. And so after a lot of discussion, we decided we would add in a radiotherapy arm exclusively for patients presenting with metastatic disease. So that kicked off in 2013. And other groups have thought both of these questions were worth asking as well. And just to illustrate the power of bolting things onto an existing trial versus starting a new trial. So the French set up a trial with both of these questions bolted into one trial as a new trial. They've just passed 200 patients into that trial now. They started setting the trial up at the same time as we did, around 2012. They've just passed 270 patients into that trial. We've now put 1,900 patients into this trial and 1,800 so far into this one. So it's just so much quicker and faster. We're answering questions at a rate that other groups simply can't do, and that's obviously to everybody's benefit. But it's nice that we're doing it. So at this point, we had enough patients in the original comparisons to stop recruitment, and that focuses recruitment on the things we added subsequently, which is why they've recruited so quickly. And I've carried on through. So we've recruited the abiraterone comparisons. You can see from this the graph of the patients in. In fact, this is somewhat old now. We've just passed 7,000 patients in. Each dot here is a patient, and you can see that the density in the control arm is getting denser and denser. We're recruiting faster and faster and faster. So it's been a fantastic exercise in terms of answering multiple questions one after the other. So we've got yet another arm now. We've put abiraterone and enzalutamide in combination. We've just passed 1,000 patients into that comparison as well. So the reason we want to combine those two drugs is that they both work in relapsed prostate cancer. Unfortunately, people will eventually get disease resistant to either of those drugs. So, but if you look at the mechanism of resistance, each drug targets the mechanism of resistance of the other one. So it kind of makes sense to combine the two. I mean, whether it turns out to make sense, we'll find out, obviously. But it's certainly a question worth asking. So essentially, we've addressed at least 8 different questions already and counting. So I'll skip through this. So just go back to the question I posed at the beginning about what's the prognosis of newly diagnosed advanced prostate cancer. So running through all of this is a sort of uniformly managed or reasonably uniformly managed control arm getting standard treatment. So we thought it worth asking the question, how have these patients actually done? And so we've done 2 papers on this. So this one we presented last year at all the various major meetings and focused on the men with cancer that hadn't spread. And so there's 2 groups. There's those where the disease is confined to the prostate and those where it spread to the lymph nodes. Now we were particularly interested in these because nobody's done a trial looking at whether you should or should not get radiotherapy if you've got lymph node spread, and the consensus view is that you should not, because nobody's done a trial. You've got this kind of circular sort of catch-22. Nobody's done a trial, so you shouldn't do it, and nobody's planning to do a trial because there's not that many men fall into this category. But because we have so many men in the trial, and we've adopted a sort of, well, you can give radiotherapy if you like approach, it turned out that we had significant numbers who did and who did not have radiotherapy, allowing us to compare the outcomes. So, so this is what we started. So this is from about a year ago. So at this point we had 5,500 odd men in the trial, of whom 1,800 were in the control arm, of whom 788 had disease that had not spread at the point where we froze the database. And then, in order to focus on the ones we were really interested in, we ended up with 721. We took a few more out for various other reasons. And so this was the first thing so when we set the trial up, I'll show you a whole lot of graphs like this. So essentially, this is the proportion who remain free of, in this case, either the disease relapse, which is failure-free survival, or remain alive. Now, when we set the trial up, so you can see at 36 months, for example, you can see that around 90% of men are still alive, for example, in this example, whereas more of them would have relapsed. So at 36 months, around about 70% or so will have relapsed. So these are called Kaplan-Meier plots. So I'll show you quite a lot of these. What we were expecting was that we were expecting the survival curve to look like this one. So one of the things that often gets used is the point at which half of the patients have experienced an event, in this case relapse. And this is, in the technical terms, this is the median. And so when you see trial results quoted as this drug makes people live 3 months longer, what they're referring to is the median survival and the difference between the two, if you like, the average survival. And they're talking about the differences in the average. And the problem with that is, of course, half do better and half do worse than an average. It's by definition, it's the point in the middle. So it doesn't in any way describe what happens to anybody apart from the one patient who happens to be slap bang in the middle. So what we're rather keener on, and I'll show you when we come back to the stats of the comparisons, is the percentage change. Because that's the thing that is much more relevant, and that's the thing that turns out to be really relevant when we look at the chemo data versus timing. So no, we were very pleased with this because we expected that the median survival, the average survival, was going to be about 5 years. But you can see it was actually taking on average 5 years for half the patients to relapse. And you can see that by 5 years out, 75% of the patients are still alive. So this is a much better prognosis than it's 50% better than we expected when we set the trial up. And most of this is down to the radiotherapy, and I'll show you the data. So the second thing we wanted to look at was the impact of radiotherapy. So when we set the trial up, radiotherapy was not standard practice. We permitted it in the trial, but it wasn't standard practice. As I mentioned already, 2 trials showed that if the cancer hadn't spread to the lymph nodes, that you improved outcomes, but nobody's done a trial in the node-positive group. So we looked at these in some detail. So 721 men in the non-metastatic part of the trial in the control arm, sorry, it's nested one within the other. Of those, 433 had disease that had not spread outside the prostate. So these are just bad-looking, with no evidence of spread. So you don't really need to be a statistician to see those are rather different proportions. And so we were therefore very interested to see what happened to the node-positive ones. And essentially it looks similar. So 98 patients planned for radiotherapy, 80 patients not planned, so a more even split, reflecting the fact that it's more controversial using radiotherapy in this context. Now, of the 98 who'd had radiotherapy, only 27 had relapsed, versus of the 80 not planned, 40 had relapsed. So not quite the same proportions, but pretty similar. Looking at this another way, so we're back to the Kaplan-Meier curves. So this is time taken to relapse. And this is only in the patients with prostate cancer confined to the prostate. So what we see, we took an arbitrary point at 3 years, was that if you had radiotherapy, only 13% had relapsed in 3 years. This is a group that we expected half of them to have died by 5 years. Only 13% had relapsed in 3 years, and versus 62%. So obviously huge difference. So the percentage way of describing this is the hazard ratio is 0.33. That's to say it's a 67% reduction in your risk of relapse. So it's an absolutely huge effect from a very simple, cheap, widely available treatment. This had already been shown in randomised trials to be the case. So all we've done is extract out similar patients and show the same in randomised trials where you'd allocate the patients as opposed to patients who had been picked. So when we looked at the node positives, we expected them to do worse. So for the node positives who'd had radiotherapy, we've gone from 87% relapsed for 3 years to 71%. So just under 30% had relapsed by 3 years. but it was over half had relapsed if they didn't get radiotherapy. So this is a big effect from radiotherapy, and we're sure this is why the survival in this cohort is looking much better, is because the widespread. So the use of radiotherapy has been going up and up and up. It's still not considered standard practice, but it is wide. To be honest, it is widely available. So it's not quite such a big percentage reduction, but it's still almost a halving of the risk of relapse. So this is data just extracted from data mined in the control arm. So by having so many men in the trial, we can answer questions we didn't even set out to answer in the first place. So I'll skip through some of this. We did the same exercise with the metastatic patients. I'm actually going to skip through this and skip to the ASCA thing, because this is mainly focused on the metastatic patients, the men where the cancer spread already. So a little sort of ego trip here. So this is, so we presented the data at the American Society of Clinical Oncology. So this is the biggest cancer meeting that takes place annually anywhere in the world. It's around 25,000, 30,000 doctors go to the meeting, and it's mostly a series of parallel sessions. But there is only one prostate oral session, and so we got top billing in that session. You can see this is like Saturday night at London Palladium. There's a whole tier here, there's another tier upstairs with the same. This is one of my co-investigators took the picture from the audience. So this is the audience sat listening there at the front. So it's the nearest you get to Stadium Rock as a So, and it's a huge meeting. You just see huge numbers of people there. So this is, we're presenting to a big impact audience. So it's it's a real testament to British oncology collectively that we're presenting stuff that has this sort of impact. And it is down to, and one of the reasons I'm so keen to come and talk to patient groups, it's down to patients taking part in trials. The UK puts more patients in cancer trials than any other country in the world, bar none. Not corrected for population size, just bar none. And it's a real tribute to British science in general and the NHS that you can do this on this sort of scale. So this is the presentation that we gave, so you know this. And the hypothesis for testing is that early use of active therapy gives you a larger absolute benefit, potentially. So we're looking at docetaxel, zoledronic acid, and the two combined. And so this is presented exactly as I gave it. So I've mentioned all these already. And we have the two outcome measures. We have the secondary outcome measure, the failure-free survival, as a sort of selector to decide whether we carry on recruiting. And then the data we're mostly focused on for this now is the overall survival. So you've seen these already. So the important point about this is we're looking at the patients recruited to these arms, and although the control arm carries on, we're only looking at the control arm patients recruited at the same time. So we're comparing like with like, because, as I said, as I've shown already, the prognosis has got better than we expected from historical trials since the trial started. So quite probably patients treated over here will have a different prognosis to patients treated 10 years ago. So you don't want to compare these patients with these patients, you just want to compare like with like. And so this is obviously a mammoth exercise, 2,962 men in this part of the trial, recruited from 2005 to 2013. Allocated, we deliberately put twice as many men in the control arm as the other arms for slightly obscure statistical reasons. Performance status relates to how fit people are, so PS stands for performance status. And so essentially 0 is completely fit and healthy, normal functioning, 1 is some impairment, 2 is you need some assistance with activities of daily living, 3 and 4 are mostly bedbound, so completely bedbound. So you don't want very unfit patients in the trial, really, if you're going to give things like chemotherapy. And the average age is a bit younger than the typical prostate cancer patient, but you can see it goes well up into the 80s, so it's pretty broadly applicable. The majority of the men going in the trial had metastatic disease, most of whom had disease that had spread to the bones, but significant numbers, as I've already shown you, had either node-positive or high-risk locally advanced disease as well. We permitted a various range of hormone therapies, but overwhelmingly it was the usual injectable things, Zoladex and so on. And we collected data on radiotherapy, which I've shown you. the majority were newly diagnosed patients, so only 6% were relapsing from previous treatment. So this is the failure-free survival curves, so the time to relapse for the zoledronic acid. So this was a bit disappointing. Just to focus on this rather than the curves, because this is a sort of more accurate description. It looks as if there's a modest effect. So a hazard ratio of 0.93 means there's a 7% improvement in the time to treatment failure. Now, these are called the confidence intervals. So if it crosses 1, it means it's not statistically significant. So the upper limit is above 1. So basically, there's a modest reduction or improvement, rather, a modest improvement in the time to relapse, but not enough to be statistically significant, and certainly not enough to be clinically significant either. And not very surprisingly, that in turn didn't translate into any significant improvement in overall survival either. So this obviously was disappointing, but it actually answers a question. You shouldn't be giving zoledronic acid to newly diagnosed patients, which actually, when we set it up, was an important question, and this puts it to bed, basically. However, when we look at the chemotherapy data, this is docetaxel, this is time to relapse, what you can see is that there's a huge increase in the time to relapse. So if we look at the median, so the point where half the patients have relapsed, it goes up from 21 months to 37 months with chemotherapy. This is for all the patients in the trial. So that's whatever that is, a 16-month improvement, and that is highly statistically significant. So the chance of this is a fluke is less than whatever that is, 1 in 10 million, I don't know. So it's a very robust statistical result. That's not a fluke, and that translated into a survival advantage. So basically, and the hazard ratio means it's 0.76. That means there's a 24% improvement in the survival times from giving chemotherapy at diagnosis. Now, the significance of this is that the improvement in survival if you give docetaxel at relapse is the same. It's a 24-25% improvement. But the big difference, and I'll come back to what that means in absolute terms, is that if you're multiplying a 25% improvement on top of a survival of years, you're bolting years on. If you multiply a 25% improvement on the survival of a year, you're bolting 3 months on. So although the proportionate effect is the same, the absolute effect is much bigger. And that's the really important conclusion from this data, is that not that the drug doesn't actually, in a sense, work any better if you're giving it at diagnosis to giving it at relapse. It does exactly the same. It's just you're multiplying by a bigger number, and therefore you get a bigger absolute gain. For the combination arm, it essentially looks like the chemo arm, so I won't go through that in too much detail. We'll skip through these to this one. So if we look at the subgroup of patients with metastatic disease, so these are the ones we have the most statistical confidence about, because sadly they're more likely to have died, and we were looking at the effect on survival time. We can see that for the control arm, the average survival, I should say actually, when we set the trial up, we expected the average survival for this group to be about 2 to 3 years. Turns out the average survival was just under 4 years. So the control arm has anyway done better than we'd expected, and that's undoubtedly because drugs like abiraterone and so on have appeared since we set the trial up. So that's good news. This is good news in itself, but clearly you'd like to do better. And then if we look at the arm with the chemo, it goes up to 65 months. So basically we go from, it's an improvement of almost 2 years. You go from 3.5 years to 5.5 years, give or take, which is clearly a vast gain. And that's a 27% improvement in survival time. So this was the thing that we got really excited about, and it rightly got a lot of attention at ASCO in Chicago last week, because it's a huge gain. And the thing about this is that the thing that got the real headlines out of ASCO was the melanoma drugs extending survival by 3 months for £150,000. And that was undoubtedly scientifically very exciting stuff, the drugs they were testing and so on. But clearly in absolute terms it's quite a modest gain. And the beauty of this is that we gave 6 cycles of docetaxel and versus 10 typically at relapse. And at relapse you're typically getting 3 months, 6 months, whatever the survival gain is, we don't really know. Versus giving less treatment early, you get a much bigger absolute gain. So this is not going to be a hard sell to the health service, because you spend less if you get a bigger gain on a drug that is off patent. So relatively speaking, health systems are quite cheap. So it's not problem-free implementing this sort of thing in the health service, but fundamentally, if you say, right, you want to spend 10 cycles over here and get 3 months benefit, or 6 cycles over here and get 2 years benefit from the same drug, purchasers aren't going to struggle with that as a concept. There will be short-term, sorry, I'm being slightly, there will be short-term issues, because obviously we're still treating patients who are relapsing at the same time we're treating newly diagnosed patients. So there's a sort of logistics issue in our chemo suites, but fundamentally the switch should be beneficial. Obviously people worry about the toxicity of chemotherapy, and clearly, so this is another sort of Kaplan-Meier things. So one of the things that was quite striking, you can see that there's an instant drop. This is time from randomisation to the last dose of docetaxel. You can see that around 10% of the patients got randomised to docetaxel and never started it, because people are obviously worried about chemotherapy. And then you can see of the ones that started it, most of them finished it. So in percentage terms, 80% got 5 or more cycles, 76% got all 6 cycles that we plan to give. And of the missing ones, 10% never started. So it wasn't that they got toxicity, they just didn't fancy it, having signed the consent form, looking at the reality of getting chemo, they didn't want it. And that's understandable, particularly when we started the trial. But the low dropout rate obviously means that it's a reasonably tolerable treatment. That is quite a low dropout rate. Obviously we have side effects, and so this is patients reporting grade 3 or above side effects, which is enough to sort of put you in bed, potentially put you in hospital. Now, in the control arm, 31% report relatively severe side effects. So hormone therapy on its own, we know, is not, I'm sure a lot of people know, is not a benign treatment. That goes up to 51% in the 2 chemotherapy arms. So there is a price to pay. And in the main, it's with the things you expect with chemotherapy, which is infections. So there's 2 lines here. Either a low white count with no infection, or a low white count with an infection accounts for the difference here, basically. But if you look post-chemotherapy, so this is just a snapshot at a year, at the numbers of patients reporting grade 3 or above serious side effects at 1 year, so we had various points at which we collected this data, so this is the 1 year time point. You can see there's no difference between the control arm and the chemo arm. They're exactly the same, 9.7, 10.1%, that's not a statistically significant difference. So basically you get a hit from the chemo, mostly in the form of infection-related complications, which in the main are quite easy to manage. But once it's gone, it's gone. You don't have a carryover of increased burden of increased toxicity post-treatment. The other thing that we were very interested in was whether the differences arose because it somehow affected the treatment down the line, and we somehow biased people who got the chemo up front to getting more of everything else down the line. So this is looking at the similar sort of thing. So from the point where patients relapsed, we were interested in how long it took them to get further treatment. So we're not at the moment looking at which treatments they got, but you can see it didn't matter which arm you were in, everybody's getting their next treatments if they relapsed at around about the same time. And so this is the proportion starting another treatment. We also were looking in some detail at treatments which we know increase survival. So this could have included treatments like bicalutamide or silbestrol or the zoledronic acid, which we know don't increase survival on their own. Whereas this is looking at drugs like abiraterone and enzalutamide, chemotherapy if you haven't had it already. So life-prolonging therapies. And again, there is no difference. The time taken to start a life-prolonging therapy is the same, irrespective of what arm you're in. All these curves cross over each other. But what did change was what treatment you got. So for the standard of care, the control arm and the zoledronic acid arm, the treatment you were most likely to get at relapse was chemotherapy, if you hadn't had it already. For patients who'd had chemotherapy up front, the treatment you were most likely to get when you relapsed, so that's these 2 arms, was abiraterone. And so although so although the aggregate time to treatment was the same, the actual treatments got varied, as you might expect, depending on what you'd already had. But in particular, one of the things that was, I've got the wrong thing highlighted here, was the amount of abiraterone everybody got was about the same. So whatever the difference in survival is down to, it's not down to different rates of getting abiraterone, which is something that people had suggested might happen, because obviously whether you're pre or post chemo affects whether you can get abiraterone or not at various times in the trial. Like if you haven't had chemo, you can't get abiraterone if you live in Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland still. But actually that appears to have kind of come out in the wash here somehow. So our overall conclusions were that docetaxel improves survival for hormone-naive prostate cancer. Zoledronic acid doesn't improve survival. The combination of the things reformatted itself somehow. Using both of them also improves survival, but there's no obvious reason to use both of them rather than just docetaxel really. And so this is jumping around. But also the trial itself, we think it was novel when we set it out, and it's now, we think, a model for how you should do trials. And so our conclusions overall, and this is our personal view as opposed to official NHS view or whatever, was that docetaxel should be considered for routine practice in suitable women with newly diagnosed metastatic disease, for sure. If you look at the subgroup with non-metastatic disease, because thankfully so few non-metastatic patients have died, we don't really know what the impact is on survival yet. We'll have to follow up for longer. But because we're delaying relapse by 40%, so yeah, if you're going to relapse in a year, you'll relapse in a year plus 40%, whatever that is, 18 months, give or take. We think the gain in time to relapse is probably worth it for at least some of those men, and so it's a discussion that we're envisaging having. Now, clinicians, I know from discussing it, vary on at what point they think you should flick from no chemo to chemo, but certainly for some men, I think there's a role for it. And so the last few slides are, just to show you the scale of this, it takes me 5 slides to go through all the people who put patients in the trial across the UK and Switzerland, plus we've got a sort of cast of thousands at the MRC Trials Unit, patient representatives, Robin is here somewhere, and others. And plus, for all of these sorts of trials, you have an independent committee looking at the data continuously, monitoring it for safety, making sure we're not actively harming people, for example. And then there's a third committee sitting above all of that, advising the funders, in this case Cancer Research UK. So we've had a whole load of things, but plus the pharmaceutical industry has supported this with unrestricted grants. So they've given us drug and support towards the trial without strings. So the pharma industry gets, quite rightly sometimes, a lot of bad press, but often I think unjustly. And so in this case, Sanofi and Novartis funded the zoledronic acid and the chemotherapy, the docetaxel, despite the fact they knew that their drugs would be off patent by the time we reported the results. So both docetaxel and zoledronic acid are off patent. So they were never going to benefit from selling more drug in a novel setting. They supported it as a sort of, good citizen type act. I'm sure they've got, commercial motives for it as well. But the most obvious one, that they would sell more drug if the trial was positive, was not amongst them. And of course, so my last slide is this, so plugging my barbecue, which we have on the table. So, and this is something I'm very interested in as well. So one of my patients, Johnny Coo, you have it on the table, a Jamaican chap who's a musician, jazz musician. He came into my clinic a few years ago and said, I'll get some of my friends to come and do a concert for you. And he duly did that, and his friends turned out to include Courtney Pine, who I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, who's a world-famous saxophonist, who's now done 2 concerts for us. I'm sadly, Courtney's not paying at this. But one of the things that was very striking, and actually I hate to say it, it's striking about this audience, is you're pretty much all white. And whereas prostate cancer is twice as common in men of African origin, and has twice the death rate as well. So it's not only more common, it has a worse outcome. And I'm very aware that when I talk to audiences like this, I'm mostly talking to people like myself, sort of slightly posh middle-class white people. And there's nothing wrong with being slightly posh middle-class white people. But you're not the only people that get prostate. We're not the only people that get prostate cancer. And the striking thing in these music concerts has been that we've been doing them to mostly black audiences. And so we've developed a whole series of various pieces of music which we're using as a way of disseminating information. And we're doing this with a number of people, with the QE charity, with my own group at the University of Warwick. Obviously I work in both organisations, but also with Prof as well, various of you here today I know. And we're doing it also through the Black and Ethnic Minority Committee at Unite, the union, who it's been very interesting. So Unite obviously had massive amounts of bad press recently of the Labour Party leadership, probably justly so, I suspect. But actually dealing with the other end of the union, you realise this is actually a really worthwhile organisation. And so they've been promoting this stuff as well through them. So we're using music as a tool to do outreach in a sort of different sort of way, really. So I think that's my last slide, so thank you for your attention.